Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me. My co-host here, Mike Pagan. You've joined the Introduction to Azure, Considerations and Best Practices, or at least hopefully that's what you're planning to attend. That's what we'll be talking about. My name is Clint Lentner. I'm a solutions architect with Network Center, and Mike is with me today, also a solutions architect. So the intent of our meeting today, basically we're going to walk you through a high level of what is Azure. So if you have no idea and you're just considering, like to know more, this is the presentation for you. And even if you've been working with Azure for a little bit, the second half of our presentation focuses on best practices. So a little bit of everything for everybody. We have a lot of content to get through, so we're going to jump in and go ahead and get started. While we're going through, though, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the question box, and if we have time at the end, we'll certainly do our best to answer them. If we run out of time, still please submit them, and we'll get back to you. Anyway, starting off with our agenda, we're going to be going through a couple different topics. So first, what can I do with Azure? Very high level, and then with each section, I want us to go back to the question of considerations. Is Azure a good fit for me? Mike and I do quite a bit of work with our clients, and one of the big questions that keeps coming up is, I hear everybody's moving to Azure or Amazon or any public cloud. Does that necessarily make sense for us? And we'll help you kind of ask some of the right questions for that. We'll touch on pricing. It's not free, and there's certainly a pricing element to it. And then we'll get into best practices, and like I said, Q&A if we have time. So some of the most common uses that we see with Azure, infrastructure as a service, basically your virtual machines. If you currently have a Hyper-V environment or a VMware environment on premise, you can think of just essentially Microsoft takes that off your hands, and you spin up virtual machines in the Azure environment and run from there. So if you already know how to manage a virtual environment, jumping into Azure isn't all that different. Second up, we have remote storage and backup, disaster recovery. And again, we'll go through each of these a little more in detail as we go along. Identity management, we won't be touching on too much, but just something to be aware of that any Microsoft 365 service, be it Power BI, Office 365, any of those things, they all use Azure Active Directory on their backend, which is also stored in Azure. So some of you may have seen this document or something similar. Microsoft likes to use it in a lot of their marketing material, and it's the shared responsibility model. So let's briefly go through that. On the right here, you can see the on-prem. All of the blue squares represent the customer, or that's you. This is your environment right here. In a traditional on-premise environment, potentially or possibly what you have today, you basically manage all of it. Now, when you move over to a public cloud or a hosting provider for infrastructure as a service, here, Microsoft is taking over the physical data center, the network, and the physical host, where you still maintain the operating system and everything below. We won't be getting too much into the other two here, but there's also platform as a service. So now Microsoft also takes over the operating system, and there's a shared responsibility on networking applications that are in place and identity and directory infrastructure. And then there's software as a service. And most of you most likely already have some form of software as a service. I know Salesforce is a great example where you essentially just sign up, log in, and you have a shared responsibility for identity and directory infrastructure. And the rest of it, Microsoft or whoever not with Salesforce in particular, but with the software as a service model, they're basically just giving you their entire service, and you sign in and manage who has access to it. One of the things I like to do with public cloud, or just the term cloud itself, is kind of take that and put it to the side, and let's not talk about the marketing term, but let's talk about what it actually is. Azure is a bunch of data centers that Microsoft has throughout the world. You can see here the North American data centers. Microsoft has tried to select locations, so really no matter where you are within the US, there should be a data center that's fairly close to you, of course, the continental US. And we'll be doing a demo with Azure, and we'll be coming back to this slide, or rather some content that references this slide, so we know kind of where we're choosing some of these data centers. Again, going back to infrastructure as a service, virtual machines, some of the things that we see used or that Azure is used for, creating new deployments. So if you have a brand new application, a new server that you want to spin up, labs and testing, and we'll be going through a demo of basically building out a lab. Takes very little time. Lift and shift, meaning that you can take your existing infrastructure and copy it, if you will, to the Azure environment and run it there. So you don't necessarily have to rebuild, though we typically recommend doing so. But there is an option if, for whatever reason, it doesn't make sense for you to rebuild your server platform. And flexible workloads, typically something like if you have a web farm and you need to spin up maybe 50 more web servers because holiday season is among us, and then once that's done, you go back down to 50% capacity. So one of the things I wanted to touch on, just give you a high-level example of what an Azure environment it would look like. So here we have Azure AD, your Azure environment. You've got a server and the server resources all wrapped up within a subscription. Typically, you would have your site. So this would be whatever you have in place today. And notice the redundant network lines that are connecting to the Azure environment. Again, if we go back to that previous slide, these data centers are throughout the US. So just like if you currently have a hosting or a colo data center with somebody, you certainly want to make sure that you have enough bandwidth and then B, redundancy across those lines. If these lines get cut, you have no access to your Azure environment. And not only can you access your Azure environment from your site, but also if you have managed workstations, home users, anything like that, they can also access these same resources. And then if you have resources that you want the public internet to be accessing, same concept there. So some considerations, as we mentioned before, with each one of these, let's talk about, is Azure a good fit for me? Is the infrastructure a good fit for me? This is a design that I see often, and I feel like it is a good fit for customers who have a need similar to this. So here you can see we have a domain controller built out. We have a remote desktop server or servers, depending on how many users need to access the service. And then we have an application and file server. So you'll notice all of the data is local or essentially located within where it needs to be accessed, meaning that your users are going to be running everything from the remote desktop server, and they're accessing things here on the application and file server. This could be a SQL server, anything like that. Now here's your site. This might be a primary location where you access RDP. And again, here are your home users, remote users. They're also able to log in. And now what you'll notice is we don't currently have any servers here on site that need to interact with the remote desktop server. You certainly can, but now once you do that, you have to take into consideration the additional lag time that it's going to take for that data to traverse your network and come back. So that's typically why we recommend, like in the example here with the application file server, putting it right in the same data center as your remote desktop server. Another similar application to this, we have a application web server. So the only thing that's changed here really is instead of remote desktop services, it's application web server. So a different way of presenting the application, but still we have our database and file server and our domain controller. So all of the computing functions that need to happen are close together. And then here's the example that I gave before with your web servers, where if you need to, you can spin them up at a moment's notice or turn them down as needed. Okay, so at this point, actually, yep, my apologies. Let's go through what are some of the specifications. We'll talk about specifications, and then we'll get into a quick demo. So some of the things when creating resources within Azure, what are your server specifications, right? So same kind of concept as if you were running this on premise. How much storage do you need? How fast does that storage need to be? How important is the user experience? In the example that I gave with the remote desktop service, my user experience needs to be pretty darn close to what it would be if it was on premise. Well, if that's the case, then I need to make sure that all of the readily available resources are moved to Azure together so that there's not a large delay going across my WAN link. What needs to be backed up and how often? Again, just because we move server workloads to Azure doesn't mean that we don't back them up. And then what other resources need to interact? Again, with the remote desktop example, making sure you have all of your resources right there in the same pool. So at this point, I am going to break out of our presentation and move to the Azure portal. So by default, there's not a whole lot here within the Azure portal. You first browse to portal.azure.com. In this demo, we've already purchased a trial environment, the subscription, and we have a single server that's up and running. But I'd like to walk us through just how easy it is to create a new server. So click on virtual machines. We're going to add a new virtual machine. And this is live, so it should work. It usually does, but it is all web-based, and occasionally we may run into hiccups. So we're going to create demo 02. Remember I had mentioned about the regions, the different data centers. So here we can select which region, which data center we create our resources in. So US Central, I believe that's in Iowa, or we can choose US North Central, which is in Chicago. You may have reasons for one or the other. For this example, we're going to stick with US Central. And then right here is our image, which we can easily select Windows Server 2019. You'll see any supportable version of Windows Server is available here, so 2019. And then we get to select our size. So by default, we have a very common size, but if you choose select size, it's going to give you a list of all the different available virtual machine sizes. This can be very overwhelming as there are a lot of them, and each of them have kind of a special reason behind them. So for an example, your B series are a burstable series, meaning that they're good for workloads where maybe like a domain controller or something where it's kind of quiet most of the time, but there may be a few periods of high CPU or memory activity. For the most part, especially if you're newer to Azure, I strongly recommend the D series. D series are used for general workloads. And now you can also see here, we can choose our vCPU, how many vCPUs, how much RAM. The other thing is looking at max IOPS. Now, one thing that really differs here from managing your own on-prem environment is you're not able to select, I want 3 CPUs or I want 2 CPUs and 6 gigs of RAM. The Azure virtual machines come pre-configured. So really, you're going to have to select the server that's closest to what your needs are. So in this instance here, we're still going to stick with the D2S V3. This is the one that it recommended. It's a very general purpose, very common virtual machine, 2 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM. Okay, we're going to go ahead and hit select. And then create an administrator account. You do need to pick something that's not common. So if we type in administrator, it's going to bark at us. So instead, we're just going to do Azure admin. And type in our password. There we go. Okay, and by default, in a testing environment, this is okay, but traditionally in production you wouldn't do this. But Microsoft does open up port 3389 or RDP to public internet. This allows you, if you don't have any other method of joining or logging into your workstation, you could do so through the internet. Again, and they warn you here that this is accessible through the internet. It's a very large security concern, but if you're just getting started for your first workstation that you spin up, you may need to utilize RDP to just get into it. For this example, we're going to close that. And then we also have an option here if we want to bring our own Microsoft licensing. You can see that would you like to bring your own Windows Server license? So if you already have Windows Server licenses and you are up to date on your SA agreements, so that's your software assurance agreement, which most of us don't have, but this is one of the additional reasons Microsoft's been pushing it. You can use those licenses here in Azure and save yourself some money. Next up, we're going to look at disks. By default, we recommend using the premium SSD if it's available for the virtual machine that you selected. There are some other tiers of disk speeds available, especially for the operating system disk. We do recommend the premium SSD. And then we're going to go, oh, and if you do want to add an additional disk, so maybe an application disk, you can just click the link here. You can select whatever size you're looking for and click OK. So here, we've got a 1 terabyte premium SSD disk, and maybe I want to change that to, all I need is 64 gigs, or it may not even need to be premium. Maybe I just want standard hard drives because it's very rarely used. One thing I do want to point out is the number of provisioned IOPS. This is very important based on what kind of application you'll be building from. You may not know offhand, well, how many IOPS do I need? But keep in mind that if you start off with a 64 gig volume and you only have guaranteed 240 provision IOPS, you may be better off going with a larger volume to meet your storage speed needs. As you notice, the larger that we go, the faster the IOPS. Okay, we're going to go just to 64 gig premium. We'll hit OK. Next up, we're going to go to networking. So here we can choose our virtual network. We already have these in place for the demo. Subnet, public IP if I want one. Currently I do not, so I'm going to click none. And then this was the same option we had before. Public inbound ports, we turn that to no. We're going to choose management. So here we also have options for enabling boot diagnostics and operating system diagnostics. So for your technical resource, if they need to do some troubleshooting, they have the ability to do that within Azure. And the only other pieces I'm going to talk about before we go ahead and create is there's an auto shutdown feature, especially in testing. This is very helpful. So any resources that are online, or I'm sorry, virtual machine resources that are online in the Azure environment, you are billed per hour that they're on. So if you're doing some testing and you forget about it for a couple of weeks, you will be charged for all of that. So by default, Microsoft has a auto shutdown. So here at 7 o'clock UTC, we can certainly change that to Central Time. So 7 o'clock Central Time, it'll automatically turn this VM off and it'll email me letting me know that it has done so. We did talk about backups. Backups in Azure is as simple as just clicking the Enable Backup for the Azure Backup product. You can choose your Recovery Services Vault, and if you have a policy that you want to go through, it's fairly intuitive. You can create a new policy. How many snapshots do you want? How long are we retaining them? Away we go. Click OK. And that's it. Okay, we're going to go ahead and review and create. So this process takes about 5 to 10 minutes to spin up. So we're not going to wait for this server itself, but here's the validation screen. Shows you how much you're going to be charged per hour. Going through, you can review all of your basics. That looks good. We hit create. And it'll give you a status update in the upper right-hand corner. Deployment is in process. So it was pretty quick to spin up a new server. As I mentioned before, one of the benefits of using Azure, it allows you to create servers pretty much on the fly, and away you go. So while that's happening, we're going to go back to our home page, go back to virtual machines, and look at our already created demo server. So here, if you click on a server, here are all the options that you get to work with. We're going to start with, so networking. You can look at the network card that's been attached. One of the things, and Mike will talk on this during the best practices, in Azure, and a lot of people get burned by this, you do need to set your IP address statically or dynamically through the Azure interface and not through the operating system. If you don't, it'll reboot and lock you out. So almost every tech that I know gets stuck with that. Here's our disks, disk speed. So one other thing that's really handy here So this disk I currently have, or this server I currently have offline. So if I want to change the size of the disk, all I need to do is click the disk, size and performance. And so just like your virtual machines, disk sizes also come in preset increments. So if I want to increase from a 128 to 256, I just go ahead and click resize. It's updating my disk, successfully updated. And then as I go back, I'll jump back into the same spot here. And this will eventually catch up. So it is a web interface. Sometimes you need to hit refresh a couple times. And there we go. We now have increased our operating system disk from 128 to 256 gigs. And once we power it on, we would expand that and be ready to roll. We've got the same flexibility on the virtual machine side. So this current virtual machine is 1 CPU and 3.5 gigs of RAM. This current, so demo 00 is currently turned off, which is also allows me to change the compute behind it. So maybe I need to double my resources for whatever reason. I just go ahead and click whatever size I need. If I want to double it from the 1 to 3.5 to 2 to 4, go ahead and choose resize. And away we go. So this takes just a little bit longer than the storage, but that's it. So I power it back on, and now I've increased my CPU from 1 to 2 and my RAM from 3.5 to 4. Some of the other things that I'll touch on here, and I know we're just kind of reading from or drinking from the fire hose. I've got a lot of information, so apologize for just kind of throwing everything at you here, but we find it very interesting. It's I think it's helpful to understand all the concepts here. Here's the auto shutdown that we talked about before. So if you wanted to adjust that, and then our backup option. So we can see that this one currently is not backed up. We can select an existing for recovery vault and just enable the Azure backup. And away it goes. All right, and there's a lot of other elements in here which we're not going to get into, but you're also able to monitor, manage. There's a lot of things that you can do here with a virtual machine within Azure. Again, we're just scratching the surface here. And now if we go back to our home, we'll see if our other virtual machine is online yet, and it is. So you can see that demo 02, which we just created, is now running, and away we go. All right, back to the presentation. So next slide. There we go. Remote storage. So what we had just gone through is an example of the infrastructure as a service, spinning up virtual machines with our remote storage. Some of the most common uses that we see, and you're probably using it today, even if you don't realize it, is OneDrive. You have a OneDrive account that's set up within or it's all managed in the back end with Azure. Infrastructure as a service file servers, we see that. So basically where you spin up a VM, your file server, and you place that in Azure. There's a Azure Files Share, so it's a service that Azure or Microsoft provides as a file share, file storage service. Azure File Sync, slightly different from OneDrive for some specialty applications, and then a third-party backup repository. We've seen those of you who use Veeam for your backup. Veeam utilizes or can utilize Azure to take a copy of your backups and store them there. So here's just a brief demo, or not demo, an example of that here. Again, we've got my on-site servers and the storage, if it's OneDrive, anything like that, and also my remote users can access those things. So as we talked about before, each one of these, let's re-ask those same questions. You know, so even with remote storage, is that a good fit for me? The same questions that we're going to ask. And then backup disaster recovery. So Microsoft uses a product called Azure Site Manager or Site Recovery Manager. It's really interesting. So basically, it keeps a replica of your servers that you protect with Site Recovery Manager in Azure. All the storage, everything that you need. Of course, this is very oversimplified. There's quite a bit of back-end work to get this up and running. But if you were to have a issue at your main data center, let's say a tornado rolls through, a flood, something like that, and it's no longer available, those servers now automatically pop up online in Azure and are ready to use. So you can see here, even though my site is no longer functional, my remote users have the ability to still log into those servers and continue with their day-to-day operations, even though our primary location is out of service. Is disaster recovery a good fit for me? So really, in addition to the other questions that we'd asked, the biggest question that we add on top of this is, what are my RTO and RPO requirements? This isn't anything new for Azure. This is any disaster recovery. And all the other questions apply just as much here. And pricing, is Azure a good fit for me? This is my last demo. It's pretty quick, but Microsoft does have a Azure pricing calculator available. And let me show you that really quick. Jump into pricing calculator. And just do a search for Azure pricing calculator. It should be one of the first hits here. And so here you can go through, and so let's say we want to spin up a virtual machine. We know we're going to need a storage account. We're also going to make sure that we have a VPN to it. And we want to make sure that it's covered with Azure Backup. And so here, now these are MSRP. This is MSRP. You can go through and configure what data center, which does matter. Pricing changes based on the data center that you select. So here's just a D2 V3 by default. Here's my storage, or I'm sorry, here's my server, the number of hours. So by default, as I mentioned before, your server, you're charged based on how many hours in a day you're using the product. Pay as you go. Microsoft does allow you to basically have reserve pricing, meaning that you're going to pay for at least a year, and they give you a fairly significant discount for that, or you could choose to pay for 3 years. Now there's a couple details around that, which we're not going to get into here, but you can also add your Azure hybrid benefit, and you can see, so if we start off at $140 for this, but if I add a reserved fee and I bring my own server license, that drops that price significantly. Anyway, so you would go through and configure your server, your environment as needed. And then when you're all done, this of course is a little ridiculous at $64. I haven't configured it, but even if you're working with a partner, it's a good idea to just have an understanding of all the pieces and the components that go into it, which is why Microsoft provides this tool here. All right, best practices for IaaS. Mike, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Clint. Hey, everybody. I miss seeing everybody in person, so you get to see me in my office here for this presentation. So I wanted to cover tips, tricks, recommendations for running IaaS in Azure. So we're going to cover a couple different areas. Saving money, data protection, networking, governance, which I think is a really big deal compared to some of the things that we do on site. Some of the utilities that are built into Azure's building into their platform they're very powerful, and they tie in with the whole backplane. So it isn't like adding a different service. They all generally just work together. Security and some other miscellaneous bits and bobs. So I added the icon list here because I really like icons, but I went through and I did a check, and I think Clint and I cover at least 13 of these icons specifically. So as we go through this, see if you can pick out which 13s may be in there. So kind of what Clint was talking about with saving money, we want to make sure that you right-size your virtual machines. We've had a number of conversations with software vendors, and they say that your virtual machine needs to be 4 virtual CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM. And most of these software requirements are written 10 years ago and not been updated to match current constructs that we have available. And as you saw in Clint's demo, we don't really have an option to choose all the different sizes that we want. So sometimes we have to make different choices when we pick virtual machine sizes. And the other really great thing about virtualization in general is the fact that we can start with a size and make sure it performs the way we want it to. And if that virtual machine is rather expensive, then we can make it smaller and it checks performance. If the performance is okay, we can roll with that and gain those savings. So setting things in Azure or any cloud and just leaving them there there's opportunities to save money. So it kind of needs some care and feeding throughout its life cycle. We also want to consider powering off virtual machines during off hours. So if you have the easy example is if you have a reporting server that only needs to run once a week. Well, if you leave it on the entire rest of the week and you're not doing anything with it, you're incurring costs for CPU and memory and operating system if you're not doing hybrid use benefit for your Microsoft licensing. So you're paying per second for the virtual machine to sit there and do nothing. So if you can power that virtual machine off and only run it for 24 hours, we saw in the Azure calculator where instead of 730 hours, it could be 24 hours, 36 hours, or whatever it works out to be. And that drastically reduces the cost of that virtual machine. We don't get to do that with reserved instances, but because you're paying for that machine to be on pretty much all the time, you're getting savings from that. But if you start with a pay as you go type of mentality, and you know your employees aren't going to work the weekends, and you have a remote desktop server, well, you can shut that remote desktop server off over the weekend and save some cost. Scaling up and scaling down virtual machine sizes is also an option. We work with a number of different types of companies, one of which is accountants. Accountants are very busy during tax season, now until whenever tax season manages to end this year. So in those cases, there's remote desktop servers. If people are going to be logged in and using them more, and they need more resources because more people are going to be on them, we can add another server, or we can make the servers that we have larger for that period of time. And then when things start to taper off, we can shrink them or get rid of that extra one and save money. They don't have to be full size all the time. Clint referenced reserved instances. There's a significant savings for that because you're committing to pay for the CPU and memory utilization. Hybrid use benefits also goes along with that. We also want to remember that when we delete a virtual machine, it deletes essentially the wrapper. You're no longer using the CPU and memory, but it does not automatically clean up the virtual disks and some of the other components that go with it. And virtual disks, you pay for whether you use it or not. So if you have a 1 terabyte premium SSD disk sitting out there, it's going to charge you whatever that cost is until you remember to take a look at it. So that is definitely something to remember, is when you clean things up, just kind of comb through your resources and make sure you don't have any extra things, because it's very easy to build things in the cloud, knowing when you delete it that it deletes all the bits and pieces so you don't pay for them is also important. We can also set up billing alerts. So if we're expecting our bill to be, say, $500 a month, and we can have the service send us an email when we're almost to $500 a month. If we're getting that in the 29th day of the month, that's exactly what we expect. If we're getting that on the 10th day of the month, something's changed. So, we've added more services, we're getting billed for more things, maybe there's more bandwidth or one of the more of a metered thing that goes up and down, and we want to log in and take a look at that. And some of the utilities that can help us with that is an Azure service, Azure Cost Management, used to be called Cloud9, and some other services like Cloud Checker or as a number on the market. So here's an example of what Azure billing looks like, and if this dotted line across the top or in the middle of the graph there is where our expected budget is, and we go back and we get our bill, and this is obviously a demonstration because I don't know anybody who has a $200,000 Azure bill, but we can kind of see around the 18th of August, whatever this navy blue graph is, was either added to the system or greatly increased in price. So we can go dig into that. We can find out specifically, was that on purpose? Who was it for? If we're doing like chargeback, send that department that so they can account for that in the accounting system. So next, let's talk about data protection. When we're talking about Azure virtual machines, we want to make sure that we're backing them up. When going through the wizard, it's a part of the process. It wasn't originally a part of the process to add the backup portion of it. And if you were going to use like JSON templates or like the Azure Quick Start pieces, or adding things differently through the marketplace, they may not automatically back up your virtual machines. So it is easy to assume that it is in the cloud, that it will never go down and everything is going to be happy. That's not the case. And then if you look at the shared responsibility model that was one of the first slides, Azure cloud providers are there to make sure the backbone is up, make sure you can get access to your system, that the operating system is running, but we're responsible for the data that is in the virtual machines. So that it's really important to pay attention and protect your data per your backup policy and whatever your regulations you fall under. And also to understand, when you create your backup recovery services vault, what replication type you have. There's local redundant storage, zonal redundant storage, and geo redundant storage. Local keeps multiple copies of your data in a building in a region, in a data center. Zonal will keep it in 2 different buildings in 1 region. And geo redundant will copy from 1 data center into another data center in a paired region. So you can see that if you consider all the different disasters, if there's a fire in one of the buildings and the building goes down, if you're only doing LRS, your backup data is not going to be protected. ZRS, if the building burns down, you're protected. But if, I don't know, Godzilla or a meteor hits the region that that it's in, then you're not protected. And then GRS, it is in Ohio and also in Northern California, so you're much more protected for that. There's different costs for that, so we want to make sure we prepare for that. When Clint went through a design where we were replicating virtual machines from on-prem into Azure, depending on the availability requirements of your applications, we can also do Azure Site Recovery to replicate your virtual machines in Azure to another region in Azure. So if you have highly redundant Windows desktop, virtual desktop environment, or web servers or RDS servers, or it doesn't really matter what it is, we can replicate them from one region to another region and put load balancers in front of it. So if there is a disaster in one region, we don't have to worry about restoring the virtual machines and spinning them back up and then getting people connected. So we can use Azure Site Recovery to fail over to these other servers that are already there, replicated with a low RPO, and get them up and available and get your business up and going quickly. Other third-party DR and backup applications use Azure as a storage location, as a replication point. Veeam and Zerto are 2 examples. Zerto can replicate your on-prem virtual machines into Azure, and you can fail over there. Veeam can be used, Veeam blob storage can be used as a storage location. So there's a lot of different ways you can use Azure to match your recovery policies that that your organization may have. And as always, make sure you test your restores, preferably before you need to restore. The Azure restore process is just different than using Veeam or Zerto or whatever application you may be using right now. So we want to make sure that we have an idea of what that looks like and an understanding of how long it's going to take and how easy it is to do, and document that process, because it is uncomfortable to try to figure that out when the organization is down and you need to recover, a subset, a bunch of your files. So here's an example, again, of replicating your an IaaS virtual machines on-prem, probably on VMware, into Azure. So networking. Networking is a relatively complicated process. It doesn't necessarily get any easier when we're talking about Azure, because at the end of the day, we're still talking about subnets, we're still talking about routing. So we need to plan our virtual networks, our address spaces and subnets accordingly. We can't overlap networks. So if you're going to connect multiple sites with VPNs or other types of connections, we want to make sure that we're not overlapping networks. By default, Azure, when you have a subscription and you create a virtual network, it always uses 10.0.0/24 network. If you have multiple departments firing up Azure with multiple subscriptions, two sets of virtual machines, unless anybody pays attention, are going to be 10.0.0/4 and 5 and 6. So when you want to connect those virtual machines together with a VPN, you're going to have to do some readdressing on one side or the other. And that is usually, it could be avoided if you paid attention to it ahead of time. If you're going to connect on-prem to Azure, as most organizations do when they're doing an IaaS type deployment, we want to make sure that your firewall and your firewall/network hardware, could be a router, could be a firewall, is supported for the types of VPN protocols and security constructs that we need to connect to an Azure VPN. So there's a long list of supported hardware manufacturers and products, and to the point of having firmware versions. So those have very specific things we need to pay attention to. Clint mentioned it. Don't modify the IP settings in the virtual machine. If you do that, you're going to get disconnected. Everybody does it. Just make sure it's not on a big production virtual machine when you do it. Remember that your egress traffic is billed. So if we're going to build an application and there's a lot of copying back and forth, you will be charged for exiting Azure to download it, to bring it on site. So just plan on that in the costs. If we're going to do point-to-point VPNs, client VPNs, we can do Radius or Azure Active Directory authentication. We do want to use the Gateway 1 SKU, because we can't upgrade from a basic to a Gateway 1. So if you think you're going to use it at some point, we want to try to do that ahead of time, because there's no upgrade path. You have to delete the old one and create the new one, and creating a virtual a VPN gateway takes about 35-40 minutes. So we don't want to do that obviously during the day. And if you have, we can add MFA to your client VPNs if you have Azure Active Directory P1 licensing. So here's an example of Azure network diagram. We can see that we have an Azure network and all the different subnets in there. So governance is an expanding area in Azure. It allows us to apply your policies, your organization's policy in Azure. So Azure Policy allows us to configure standards for your environment. If you want to make sure that your virtual machines are always backed up, you can create an Azure Policy that says always make sure it's backed up to a particular recovery services vault, or you make sure it conforms to a naming tag, has tags applied to it, and it can audit or enforce policies on these things. Azure Blueprints is a combination of using ARM templates, which is something that we upload, a big text file that has all the bits and pieces for Azure, uploads them into, they can be uploaded and create Azure resources, includes Azure Policy. It will create Azure role-based access controls and to subscriptions. So Blueprints is a way to set the foundation for a subscription, and uses some of the other management parts in their management groups, allows us to organize. If you had multiple subscriptions and resources, we can build a hierarchy to put those things together to make it more logical and to sort for billing, and then always make sure that we're using least privileges. There's many roles, from like virtual administrator to a subscription owner. We don't want to give too many permissions to people who don't need them. So here's an example of Azure Policy. Look at the third one down. It says demo audit resources without tags. So we can see that that is not compliant for that particular policy. We can get a report on that and go and fix it. And here's an example of using resource groups or management groups and blueprints. We've created 3 blueprints, and we've assigned them to different regions, and that will set RBAC, ARM templates. You can automatically deploy resources and policies for each of those locations. Security, don't allow inbound RDP or SSH. If you can possibly avoid not doing that, don't do it, because there's just too many security vulnerabilities out there. I saw once that it took 35 minutes for an open RDP server to be compromised. And if you have a IaaS environment where that virtual machine is connected through a VPN tunnel to your on-prem environment, and you happen to be just a test machine out there in Azure, that is a gateway into your network. We don't want that. So if you must do that, restrict it by IP address. If you have an option, Azure has created an option, it's called the Azure Bastion service. So if you don't want to do client VPNs connect to your environment, or don't have a remote control product to connect into it, and we're not going to use RDP, Azure Bastion is a service that allows you to log into your the Azure portal and then connect to a resource in the Azure portal. I have a screenshot of that coming up next, so it'll make a little more sense. But basically, it's RDP through the Azure portal window. Azure Sentinel is a SIM utility that the Azure team has created. So if we can send logging and events to this, and then query it. So security teams has a first-party SIM utility in Azure they can use. It's really powerful. I've seen some demos of what it can do, and it is very neat. We also want to make sure we know what our security access group, network security groups are doing. We want to try to apply them to subnets, not individual network cards, because they are combined, and it's easy to get confused about which takes precedence. So network security groups are the types of things that allow inbound ports. So we want to make sure we audit that regularly to make sure we know what's inbound. Always MFA for your admin accounts. And we also want to create a break glass account just in case MFA or Azure AD is down, like it was a couple of weeks ago. So here's Azure Bastion. You can, on the diagram on the left, you can see it's just a little service inside the Azure environment. You connect to the Azure portal through HTTPS, and on the right-hand side here, that's an example of what it looks like. We've connected to a WinVM01 virtual machine. It is displaying RDP in the browser window, and you can do SSH the same way. And here is an example of a network security group. You can see it's a very basic rule-based system, inbound rules. It even flags RDP, inbound, any, allow. That's a warning, it's a security issue. So that's what network security groups we want to review. And here's a copy, or here's a screenshot of an Azure Sentinel security incident investigation. So you can see that there's failed logins. You can see the user involved. We can see all the different resources they had access to and what probably happened based on the login. So other items, turn on monitoring, Azure monitoring, diagnostic logging. If it's not on before troubleshooting needs to happen, then we have to turn it on, wait for it to fill information into the bucket so we can look at more, we can use it to troubleshoot. We want to turn on tagging so we have an idea of what the resources are used for, which department, billing, cost center they go to. It helps with reviewing your bill and then just sorting through a bunch of resources. Naming conventions, we want to, if we're not looking at the resources often, when we look at them, we want them to be descriptive. So I can tell a virtual network, it's in production, it's in the West US, it's the first network, so on and so forth. And then when you create virtual machines, you have the option to save the construct of the service as a JSON file. If you save those, it is a description of what we created and what resources were created, and you can use it to redeploy that same resource. So here's an example of a Azure Monitor dashboard, bunch of information in there for you to consume. Here's an example of what tagging, how it can be beneficial. You can look at a long list of resources and see what they're tied to. And that is two presentations crammed into one crisp package. So if you want to learn more, Microsoft has some great offerings. Microsoft Learn literally walks you through creating and learning about Azure resources. Microsoft Azure Friday always has a video podcast of new and interesting things. Read the documents. Microsoft's actually got really great documentation nowadays, and create a free account. You get $200 of credit for the first month. Try it out. See what you can build. See what you like about it. And as always, you can contact Clint or myself if you have more questions. I know we went through a lot of information very quickly, so if you have any questions or you want some follow-up conversation about this, we are available for that later on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. So just to reiterate what Mike had said, for questions, I apologize. We ran it all the way up to the end, and it was a bit of a fire hose for this presentation. But we really hope that you at least got something out of it. And think about it. If you don't have any questions now, think about it. Think about your current environment and how how you may be able to benefit from a service like this. And feel free to reach out. If you would like to, you can email us directly. Otherwise, any contact that you have for NCI. Yeah, Mike, any other closing thoughts before we run off to our next presentation?
No, I don't have any right now.
Okay, excellent. Well, Mike and I are now jumping in to our next presentation, which is a day in the life of Office 365. So those of you who are interested in that, we'll see you in a couple minutes. Thanks, guys.